Well, do you have one of these? Do you? You're going to need it today. Like, especially need it today. We're going to go through the Bible in 4 weeks. And to do that, it's going to take some concentration. And these sermons, I just want to warn you, are going to be a little bit different than your average sermons. They're going to be a little bit different than what we normally do here because, as you can see in your worksheet, it's a lot of stuff. So make sure you have a pen. Maybe write small. That might be important because you still got the same amount of worksheet. All right. The book, the Bible. That's what we're going to study. And we're going to study this kind of in a different way than we normally do. We normally, if you can think of it like an airplane, sometimes we parachute into a text and we study the text. We study all around in every bit and every part of it. But as these 4 weeks go along, we're kind of just soaring over it. We're just kind of checking it out. So we're not getting super in-depth in any particular part these couple of weeks like we normally do. But we want to see the Bible as a whole. We want to see it as a whole story. And before we get started, there's a few things I want to talk about. First of all, the Bible is from God, right? We call this series The Book. It's because it's God's book. That's what the word Bible means. It actually just means book. That's all the word Bible means, book. It's God's book, and it's from God. 2 Timothy 3:16 says it's breathed out by God. It's God's very words. And another thing, why we're studying it together is because the Bible is one story. It is all one story. It's 66 books, but it's all really one book. And that's the idea here. We're studying one book. It's God's book, and it's all a collective story because God is the author behind it, right? And we know that he used human authors. He actually used over 40 human authors to write the Bible, and that was over a span of 1,500 years. Also, something that we should know before we get any further is we actually with our Bibles that we have an accurate translation. And the Bible is written in Greek and Hebrew for the most part, but we can trust we have an accurate translation, right? A lot of people will attack that first and say, well, you guys really don't have God's word because it's just kind of a game of telephone and stuff, and I'm sure you've heard that before, but we actually translated this Bible, the Bible that's in your laps, that was translated into English from Greek and Hebrew. It's not a bunch of different translations and then stuff gets mixed up. It's actually an accurate translation. So that's just a couple things before we get started. Tonight, we're going to study Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're going to study 5 books tonight, which I know isn't very much if we got to cover 66 books in 4 weeks, but that's important. A couple facts behind this. The author, the one who wrote this, the human author was Moses. It was written in Hebrew. The date of these events start in creation, starts from in the beginning, that's the very first line, and then it goes all the way to 1445 BC, and that's really when it was written. Moses wrote this while he's in the wilderness, going from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land before he died, and he gets this all done right around then. So, if you got those Bibles, let's open them to the very first page. The first page, Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1. It's pretty easy to find. It's like right at the beginning, so you shouldn't have any trouble. You don't need the table of contents for this one. It's page number 1 in your Bibles. If you need the table of contents, I'm sorry, that was kind of an insult, but it is the first page number 1, right there. Genesis 1:1. It says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first thing, point number 1 on that story, the story side, is creation. That's the first thing that happens, right? That makes sense, right? The creation is the first thing that goes on in this book. And notice it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not a big bang, not an accident, not evolution. God created the heavens and the earth. That's something that's so important, and it goes on in Genesis 1-2. You can write that in that parentheses, the Bible reference right there. That's what those parentheses are for. Every time we get to one of these points, you can write that in there. But over the next 2 chapters, God describes how he made the world. He did it in 6 days. God created everything in 6 literal days. Day 1, the let there be light, the light and darkness, the separation of that. Day 2, the atmosphere, then the dry land and the plants, and the sun, moon, stars, the birds, the fish on day 5. Day 6, he created land animals, and he also created something very special. In Genesis 1:27, you were in Genesis 1:1. Look down at verse 27. It says this: so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. So God has this special creation. On day 6, the 6th day, God does something special. He creates humans. He creates man and he creates woman, male and female, both of them equally created in God's image. And that's kind of hard for us to understand. We don't usually use that language. So if you make something in someone else's image, the idea is we are made in God's image. We have traits that God has. We are like him. And the way that we're like him is the difference between us and everything else in all of creation is that we have souls. We have souls that can interact with God, and we can have a relationship with God. He made us different than everything else that he created on earth. And that's special. And on the end of this 6th day, in verse 31, he says, it was very good. And the thing is, God didn't create us bad. He didn't create us as sinners. He created Adam and Eve, and it was very good. So that's something that's important. Before we get any further, God created human beings to be perfect and to have a perfect relationship with him. That's the first 2 chapters of this book. The 3rd chapter is where it all goes wrong, the fall. That's the point number 2 over there. Point number 2 is the fall. In Genesis 3, something happens. Something bad happens to mankind, the worst thing that could possibly happen because Adam and Eve chose to sin. And it all started out in that first verse where Satan says, did God really say that you're not supposed to do that? See, in the first 2 chapters, God gives them a command. He says, one thing I want you to do, just one thing I'm saying you are not allowed to do is to eat from this tree. Just don't eat from this one tree. You can have all the other trees. You can have any other food you want, but you just can't eat from this one tree. That's my one specific rule for you. And then Satan comes along, and he comes in the form of this snake, a serpent, and he says, did God actually say that? Did he really say that? So Satan comes in, and he attacks God's word. He says, yeah, I don't really think God has your best interest in mind. He knows that if you eat this tree, and in verse 4 through 6, it says, yeah, if you eat this, your eyes are going to be open. So God is being kind of selfish here. He's trying to hold something back from you. And Satan tries to deceive Eve, and he's very successful in that. And an interesting parallel I want to draw here is Genesis 3, verse 6. Let's look at that. Genesis 3, 6. Get your eyeballs down there. God's word is one story, and there's some verses that fit together because they tell the nature of sin. And here's the truth about sin, also found in 1 John 2, 16. It says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, right? That's just like 1 John 2, 16, where it says the desires of the flesh. Whatever feels good. It saw that it was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, the desires of the eyes, right there. And that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, right? It was all about her, the pride of life. See, there's 3 things right there, but the whole point of that is what sin is about is whatever feels good to me, whatever looks good to me, and whatever is really all about me. That's what Satan was getting at. He wanted Eve and Adam to sin because he was trying to get them to think about themselves, not think about obeying God. And that's why humans fell. That's why we chose to sin, because Adam and Eve chose to be deceived, and they chose to sin and break God's rules. And when they did that, they were ashamed. They were so ashamed they realized they were naked, and that was the whole point of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they made clothes, and they hid from God, and they didn't have a right relationship with God anymore. And it was because of that God chose to curse the world. He says, you're done in this garden. I made this perfect place for you, but now our perfect fellowship, it can't happen anymore because you've sinned. Now the world is cursed. They said for men, the work was going to be hard, and for women, you're going to have pain in childbirth. That was part of the curse. God put a curse on the earth, that stuff rots, it gets bad, things die. It's all because people chose to sin. Adam and Eve chose to sin. And that's really bad. But in the midst of all this, God does give a little glimmer of hope, which gives us kind of a preview for what's going to happen in the rest of this book. It's right at the beginning, but it's hope for the rest of the book. In verse 15, look at that real quick. Genesis 3:15. Check that out in your Bibles. God is talking to Satan here, and the world is being cursed by God because of man's sin. And he says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman. This is Satan. Between Satan and the woman. Between your offspring and her offspring. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What this is talking about is Jesus Christ. Adam and Eve's descendant, the seed, the offspring, which ends up being Jesus down the road, is going to win against Satan. Right here, right at the beginning, God gives hope for all of mankind right here. And he says, something's going to happen. Satan, you think you won. You think you got a victory here, and you certainly did get a victory here. But it's not going to end like that. God is going to take care of this, and Jesus is going to win. And the rest of this book is kind of like when you're watching sports. Does anybody here watch sports? Anyone like TiVo sports and like you tape it and like you don't want to get back to it, right? Has that ever happened to you? Has anyone ever ruined a game for you when like you wanted to know the ending? Or maybe it was like, I don't know, The Bachelor or something, and like you didn't know who was getting chosen, right? You don't know if it was like, I don't know, Nick or whoever the other Bachelor guy was. Is Nick one of the Bachelors? I don't know. I don't know. Don't talk to me about The Bachelor. I don't know. I just know it exists, guys. Sorry. I've never watched it, ever, I promise. But you could, like, ruin the story, right, by telling you the ending from the beginning. And here's the good thing about this story. God does tell us the end from the beginning, but the rest of this story is how the game kind of plays out. That's the whole rest of the Bible, is how God works out this salvation for all of us here in this room. So that's the fall. The next thing, point number 3, the flood. That's the next thing we get here. So we've just gone from the world was perfect, man chose to sin, Adam and Eve sinned, now there's a bad relationship with God, and the thing was, the bad relationship with God kept getting worse. Actually, in Genesis 6, it says it gets so bad that God regretted that he even made people. It says that it got worse. Genesis 6, verse 5, you can turn there. It should be a few pages over to the right. Genesis 6, verse 5. Check that verse out real quick. It says, the Lord saw the wickedness of man. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Right? That's pretty bad. He says, I look at mankind, and you guys just want to sin, and that's everything you think about, everything you do whatever feels good, looks good, is all about you. That was life on earth at this time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, this is verse 7, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, man and animals, creeping things, and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. This is what God wants to do. He wants to hit the restart button. He says, I'm done with this. I made this perfect creation, chose to sin. I'm gonna blot them out. I'll restart. I'll start over. But look at verse 8. It says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Right? And at this time, some people even estimate that there was like 1 billion people living on the planet. I know that's crazy, but like it's possible that there could have been like billions of people living on the planet at this time. Like, that's crazy. I mean, there's billions of people now, but it's taken us a long time to get there. But the world was in a better state back then, and people were living a long time, and the population was exploding, and it says that everything they did was evil. It was horrible. But there was one guy who God looked at and said, yeah, you care about obeying my word. You care. And it was Noah. And because of that, he told Noah to build an ark. You guys know this story. Noah built an ark. And sometimes this is like seen as like a good story with all the animals being saved and stuff. But actually, this is a really bad story because God kills everybody on earth. And he does save the animals, but really this is a story of judgment. God judges sin because he hates it, because it's against his nature and he cannot stand sin. He regretted that he even made humans. It was awful. It was a time of judgment. But he saves a couple. He saves 8 people. He saves Noah and his 3 sons and all their wives. And they restart. He does do a restart. And that's a funny thing. We're all cousins. Do you know that? We're all related. We all have a common ancestor, and that guy's Noah. Noah is all of our great-grandpas. So we're all related. Congratulations. Turn to the person next to you and say, what's up, cuz? Because you guys are all related. Just to let you know. I don't know if you knew that. Right? Every nation, every race you can think of, all those people, we're one race. We're all the human race, and we're all from Noah and his 3 sons. And at the end of this story of judgment, God gives a little more hope. He sends a rainbow, which I hope you know what the rainbow really means. It means that God will keep his promises. That's what the rainbow was all about. And in Genesis 9, that's what he sends, and he sends it to show that I will keep my promises. And he says the promise that he gave right then was, I will never destroy the earth with water again. I'm not going to flood the earth like this again. I'm not going to do it again. I will sustain human life here, and I'm going to keep that promise. And the thing was, sin is in man's heart, and sin messed it up again. While you had this good guy, his kids didn't end up doing good things, and after a while, there was more sin. And I know we're not going to talk about it. It's not one of your points here, but then this thing called the Tower of Babel happened after that, and God confused the languages because people wanted to give glory to themselves, and they were prideful, and they wanted to live life all about them, and he scattered them all across the land. So we started with Noah, our common ancestor, our great-grandpa. But then a lot of more people were born. The world was kind of getting repopulated, and God chose to use a certain guy. There's one guy that he picked, and that's this fourth section. We're going to talk about 4 guys in this section: Father, and then the Son, and then his son, and then his son. So 4 generations of guys, and God chose to pick them. We call them the patriarchs, which basically just means the head of the household, the fathers, the forefathers. It's like how, when we learn about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, we call them the founding fathers. That's this idea. But for the Bible, the patriarchs. That's an important Bible word that I hope that you know. God chose someone. He chose this guy. His name was Abram. Abram of Ur. He's from this city called Ur, and you might know him as Abraham. That's God's name for him, and he chose him. And in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, he promised a couple of things. He said, first of all, go to the land I'll show you. Right, so just to let you know, Abraham's from Ur. He's from this nice city, and he's got a lot of stuff, and a wife, and a he's not having a family yet, but he's got a lot of great stuff. He's got a lot of money and relatives, and he says, leave all that. Go to land I'll show you, because I'm going to make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. See, guess what that is? That's another reference of somebody's going to come, and somebody's going to bless the whole earth, and that's Jesus Christ. So the line has gone from, we know it's from Eve, and then it's through Noah, and now it's through Abraham. So God turns his focus, kind of like if you're looking at a big page of words, right? And you kind of focus in on one word. That's kind of the idea here. God focuses in on this guy, and the rest of this story today is all going to be about his descendants. And the most famous descendant of his ends up being Jesus Christ. So he promises all these things. He promises some important promises to Abraham right here. Also in Genesis 15, we don't have it up here, but he promises Abraham a son. So Abraham's old at this point, and his wife is also old, and they don't have a kid, right? But he says, in you, I'm going to make this big nation. And that seems ridiculous, right? But he promises that, and he says, Abraham, you need to trust me on this. So he does. But I just want to give you a little visual here. He lives in the land of Ur. That's right there. That's this city. And it's like, okay, this was pretty cool. Like, Ur was like, I don't know, L.A. It was awesome. There was a lot of famous people. It was cool. There was houses. We've even dug up stuff. Archaeologists have dug up stuff, and it's like this great city, and it's huge. It's awesome. And he was rich. And so this guy had a great life. But he says, leave that all behind and go to a land that I'll show you, which ended up being this land over here, Canaan, a land that he'd never been to. He didn't want to go to, but God said do it, and he did it. So he obeyed. That was awesome. It took a lot of faith to do that. And the problem was it wasn't very easy. Starting out, even in Genesis 14, there was stuff going on, and Abraham's cousin Lot was like getting destroyed by the people in the land, and he had to go fight an army. Like, he basically took on an army with like 300 dudes. That's what Abraham had to do. So he had to fight. And then in Genesis 19, more judgment, more sin. God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot was staying, because of their great sin. So there's more judgment and sin, and it's really not a good time. He's patriarch number 1, Abraham. He had a hard life. It wasn't easy for him, but he still obeyed God. And that's something important for us to even think about, right? Just like Abraham obeyed God when it was hard, we need to obey God even when it's hard. Even when it doesn't feel like it's a great plan for our life or stuff is going super well, it wasn't easy for Abraham, and it's certainly not going to be easy for us either. But we get to this next guy. God promised a son, and God delivered. And you see those old people who have a kid? That's basically what it was like. Isaac, this guy was born in Genesis chapter 21, moving along in Genesis. This guy named Isaac is born. He's the child of the promise. So God promised in Genesis 15, I'm going to give you a son. And Sarah actually kind of laughed. She was like, oh, that's ridiculous. I'm 90 years old. I'm not going to have a kid. I mean, when's the last 90-year-old you saw popping out babies? Like, that's messed up, man. I don't know. Like, really old. Like, these are older than your grandparents. These are like your grandparents' parents. These are your great-grandparents, picking up their kids at the nursery. Like, that's ridiculous. That doesn't happen. That's a miracle. So God did that because he wanted to prove to everybody, and even to you and me, that he can do what he says he's going to do, and he will keep his promises. And then in Genesis 22, God tested Abraham and said, yeah, Abraham, I know I gave you this son. You've wanted him your whole life. Go kill him. Do that for me. What? Why? Okay. And he gets up in the morning. He doesn't complain, and he does it. But right before he's about to kill his son, God intervenes and stops him and says, yeah, Abraham, now I know that you love me more than anybody else. You love me more than even your own son. And that's Abraham for you right there. He gave it all up for God, and God blessed him. Just like he promised, God kept his promises. He was faithful. That's what the word faithful means. It means he's going to do what he promises, which is awesome. We see that in Abraham's life. Then in Isaac's life, he marries this girl named Rebekah, who Abraham finds at a well, which was, I don't know how you found wives back then, right? You go to a well, they feed you water, then there you go. She's a keeper, right? She's a servant. She's a Proverbs 31 woman. There you go, right? Then they have two sons. Isaac and Rebekah have two sons. Their names are Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older one. Jacob is younger. They're twins, though, which is kind of crazy. It's like the first time we run into twins here in the Bible. I'm sure there was other twins, but twins. I don't know. It's weird. Twins are weird to me. I'm sorry if you're a twin, but that's awesome. Like, there's two of them, and they're in the womb, and it even talks about what they do in the womb. They're like fighting. You ever have a sibling that you just naturally fight with, right? That's Jacob and Esau. They're just not. There's opposites. Like, I always think me and my brother are opposites. Like he's all chill out. I'm all high strung. Like he's all like laid back, and everyone likes him. And I don't know. I'm the opposite. But these guys were like crazy opposites. Even their appearance was opposite. One of them was hairy. One of them was smooth. One of them was a mama's boy. One of them was a dad's son. I don't know. Father's son. I don't know what the antithesis of mama's boy. I don't know. But yeah, like that's who he was. Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older one. Jacob's the younger. And here's the thing. Back in the day, they usually, and almost always, without exception, would pass this important line. All the stuff goes to the firstborn, Esau. But God does something different. God chooses to use Jacob, the younger son. And God chooses to send his love, which is so undeserved. I mean, you could go back and read this. Jacob is a fox, man. He does everything wrong. He's a liar and a deceiver, and he's horrible. But God chose to love him, even though he didn't deserve it. And he loved him so much, he gave him the promise. And in Genesis 27, Jacob deceives his dad. I mean, he straight up lies to his dad with the help of his mom, which it was a terrible. You guys think you have family drama? This family had drama. Like, look at them. Like, he's lying to his blind dad. Like, that's how bad this was, right? So, he's not a good guy. But God chooses to love him, and he chooses to send the promise on him. And he changes his name from Jacob to Israel. Israel, that's a word I'm sure you've heard before. He changes this guy, Jacob, into a man of God named Israel after he fought with him all night. It says that Jacob, who was renamed Israel, fought with God, which is kind of weird, and we don't completely understand it, but what we think is that he fought with Jesus. They wrestled. That's what it says. They wrestled together. And after that was all over, Jesus touched his side, and he had a limp for the rest of his life to show that I wrestled with God. And they had an exchange, and in the end, he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. That was Jacob. He was ambitious, and he did it for God in the end, and he turned out to be a good guy. Wasn't a perfect guy, though, because he did something wrong, something you shouldn't do as a parent. He played favorites. So he had 12 sons, 12 strapping sons. I like this picture because I think it pretty much exemplifies their family, right? Joseph is the guy going like this, because he's the favorite. That's the one with the coat of many colors. Remember him? That's this fourth guy, the fourth patriarch, Joseph, right? So you got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then this guy named Joseph, who's really important in the end of the book of Genesis. He's talked about basically from Genesis 37 on to the end. He gets more airtime than even like Abraham. Or actually, he's about the same airtime as Abraham, but more airtime than Isaac and Jacob. So he's really important in the book of Genesis because what happens is Jacob has 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. They're all got those names: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all these guys. They end up being like the fathers of a bunch of houses. It's like if I was like Mr. Orange County and I had a bunch of sons, and one of my sons' name was Laguna Hills, and the other was Mission Viejo, and the other was Irvine. He was a popular guy. He was strong. San Clemente I had, he was kind of a weak dude. RSM, he kind of stayed to himself. I don't know. Like, that's the idea. He has a bunch of sons, and they end up being the leaders of all these clans, and there's a bunch of people that are their families from this main family. And the thing is, right before this all happens, Joseph, who is Dad's favorite kid, maybe your dad's favorite kid, I don't know, but Joseph didn't turn out for him to be Dad's favorite kid. It wasn't a good thing because his brothers hated him, and he had dreams, and God gave him special revelation, and his dad gave him a special coat, and it was bad because his brothers hated him and sold him into slavery. They literally threw him in a pit, like in a well, and they tore his cloak and took it back to his dad and lied to his dad. There's a lot of lying and bad stuff in this family. It was bad. Joseph was sold into slavery, but it ended up being even worse. He was, doing well in Israel or in Egypt. He gets sold into slavery. He's a slave of this guy, but the Lord blesses him, and he does well, and then he gets accused of a crime that he never committed, and then he goes to jail, and he spends a lot of time in jail by himself, and it was a bad time, but it was horrible. And then once we get to Genesis 42, he gets out of jail, he interprets Pharaoh's dream by God's power, and then he gets promoted. He's like the second in command to Pharaoh. It's like he's the vice president. So he goes from being this slave then to being a felon in jail, and now he's the vice president of Egypt. Right? And the thing that happens is there's a famine in the land, so there's no food. There's not enough food for people to live on, so people would go down to Egypt. And part of him interpreting Pharaoh's dream was God told Pharaoh through Joseph that there was going to be a famine. So they saved up all the grain and stuff, so they had a lot of grain. And then when there was the famine, not enough food for everybody came down to Egypt to buy stuff from them. And some of the people that came down were Joseph's brothers. And, he's looks like Mr. Pharaoh over there. You see him with the weird headdress, and he's all shaved and stuff, and all of his brothers are all rugged and stuff with the beards. Like, he obviously was not recognized. So his brothers come down and want to buy food, and, they play games for a little bit. But in the end, Joseph reveals that, hey, I am your brother Joseph. And they freaked out because they're like, oh, man, he's going to kill us. Because they sold him into slavery, but Joseph has the right heart. He says, what you meant for evil, you did all these things, and you meant them for evil, but God meant them for good. And it was because of all that Joseph actually saved the family. They wouldn't have lived. They would have died with the famine, but they all came down to Egypt, and they lived in Egypt for 400 years. And they went from about 72 people in this big family. I mean, my family is 5 people, but maybe your family is like 72 people. But this family is a big family. 72 people come down, and after 400 years, there's over 2 million people. So God blesses them in Egypt. The problem is stuff goes wrong in Egypt, and that's where we end the book of Genesis. We start a new book, the second book in the Bible. Number 5, Exodus. Exodus. If you don't know what that word means, look at the exit sign right over there. You might understand it. Exit, where they exit, they leave the land of Egypt. And while they were in Egypt, they did well at the beginning because Joseph was, famous. He was the vice president. This is Joseph's people. We're going to take care of them. And the Pharaoh liked him at the beginning, but after a few generations, they stopped liking the Israelites. They became powerful and they got jealous. So what ended up happening after there's about 2 million people, 400 years later, is they were enslaved. Israel was oppressed. So they became slaves in Egypt. Egypt was this powerhouse. You can go to a museum. I went to like 1,000 museums when I was in Europe just now. I mean, I got way too much Egyptian history I didn't even like it by the end. But look, they were oppressed because there was this strong empire. But God sends someone to fix that problem that he works through. This guy named Moses, the author, right? Enter the author. The author comes in this second book, and he's born, and it says that he's beautiful. I don't know if you've ever seen a beautiful baby, but that's what Moses was like. He could have been like, the Pampers baby, with the really big cheeks and like the fat that goes like over, like with his arms. You know what I'm talking about? He was a beautiful baby. That's what the Word of God says. Just to let you know. Maybe you didn't know that. Moses was a beautiful baby. So his parents tried to save him. They put him in this raft. They sent it down the Nile. They trusted God. They said, God, I know that the law of the land is to kill our son because they were trying to be oppressed even more. But he says, I know that's not right. I'm going to put him in a basket. I'm going to trust you, God. And what ended up happening was the daughter of Pharaoh, so the king's daughter, the princess, ends up getting this baby out of the river and says, oh, this baby is cute. I want it. So she takes care of it. But actually, she has a random Israelite woman take care of it, which ended up, guess what, being Moses' real mom. Moses' real mom got to take care of her son for a while, which was really cool, and God worked that out. But he ends up growing up as the Prince of Egypt. You remember that movie, Prince of Egypt? Did anyone watch that movie? That movie's awesome. I watched it all the time when I was a kid. But that's what happens. He ends up being, he's the princess's son, adopted son, so he ends up growing up right alongside the next Pharaoh. So he's powerful. He's important. I mean, Moses is one of the most important people in the land. But something happens in Exodus chapter 3. Let's turn there. Exodus 3. Something happens. Moses does something good and bad. What he does is he sees these Egyptians oppressing the Israelites, and he knows that's bad, and he says, that's not okay. And he ends up killing one of the Egyptians. He kills the slave driver, and that was not a good thing. And he ends up getting in trouble, and Pharaoh wanted him dead, so he fled the country. He went to this place. He's 40 years old now. Moses is well into his adult life, and God shows up in a burning bush. That's what happens. And in Exodus 3:2, it says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of the midst of the brush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. So this is some weird phenomenon going on. Like God is in the bush, and the bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. It's not like when you light a candle and the candle goes down and stuff. This is just keeps on burning, something special. Look at verse 6. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, remember him, Isaac, and Jacob. This is 400 years later. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Something we need to know about God from this passage and many others in this section of the Bible is that God is scary. God is someone to be feared. He is not a grandpa in the sky. He's not an old man in a rocking chair. He is literally in a flame of fire, and Moses is afraid to even look at him. Verse 10 says, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God heard Israel's prayers, and he's going to redeem them out of the land. And Moses isn't too sure. He says in verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Well, that's kind of a dumb question, because he's like the most qualified in the world to do this. But he says, I doubt my own ability. I don't think I'm good enough. I'm not the right guy. And God says, no, you are the right guy. And he gives excuses. He's like, what do I even call you? What do I call you? And in verse 14, one of the most important verses in all the Bible right here, Exodus 3:14, God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people, I am has sent me. That's the word Yahweh. I don't know if you ever heard that word before. That's an important word. Yahweh. That's God's personal name. Yahweh. This comes from this I am. God is everlasting to everlasting. God is God. He is in control. He is in charge. He is the God of all creation. He did it all. God. Yahweh. I am. So, he ends up obeying. And what happens is Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He doesn't want to let the people go. And in Exodus 7 to 12, a lot of stuff happens. He sends 10 plagues. And what's interesting about these 10 plagues is God does this to show that he's God. And not only does he say, oh yeah, I'm God by sending all these plagues and being in control of nature. Actually, each one of these specific miracles that God does actually pinpoints something interesting about Egypt. See, Egypt had a lot of gods, and they were in control of a lot of things, they supposed, and God like attacked individual gods. He basically said, yeah, here's God of the livestock and stuff. I'm going to kill all the livestock. You think you're being protected from this and this and this and this God and this God, and he just goes after it with the flies and the gnats and the livestock and the darkness and the hail and the locusts and all that stuff and the sores. So he sends these plagues to show that he is God, if to no one else, to Pharaoh. And in the end, Pharaoh does let them go. And that's really the idea of the Exodus, when the people exit. So we end up being in Exodus 12 here, and it's the story of the Passover, right? Remember, kill the lamb, put the blood on the doorpost, and God will pass over the house, and he won't kill the people. Chapter 13, they leave, they're out, and what they're being led by is this pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud by day, so they know where to go because God's leading them. And then Exodus 14, they run into a little roadblock. It's called the Red Sea, and that's no problem for God. God is in control, in command, so he has the Red Sea parted, and they all go through, and then all the Egyptians want to come in, and God attacks them, and they all die. I mean, God is so in control of every situation that goes on here, even in the book of Exodus. So now we end up being in the sixth part, the wilderness. So we're in the wilderness. This is the last of the six things, a part of the story. We're in the wilderness. So this starts in Exodus 15. Once they get through the Red Sea, they show up at this place called Mount Sinai. And this journey to go from Egypt to the promised land, the land that God promised to Abraham at the beginning, and then he promises to Moses in this section, it should have taken like less than a month. So it was like 300 miles, so that's a long way to get 2 million people hauling across the desert, but it shouldn't have taken that long. But what ended up happening was God disciplined them because of the things that they did, their sin, and they ended up being in the wilderness for 40 years. Think about it. It's like us trying to get to like San Francisco, right? But it took them 40 years. So this was serious. And like I said, they showed up at Mount Sinai. That's Exodus 19. That's God's mountain, and God meets them there, as you can see in that picture. So well done by the Sunday school people that I found on Google Images, right? There's like this fire, all this stuff on the mountain. It's this powerful scene. God is on the mountain. In Exodus 20, something that you should take note of, I hope you know this chapter, it's where God gives the 10 Commandments. That's what happens here. And the idea, what's so important about the 10 Commandments is it's God's first written words. It's the first time any words from God are written down. So Moses writes these books after this, but this is the first time God ever speaks in like words and that are written down on the pages. So this is super important. We get the 10 Commandments. And then Exodus 32, while he's up there for a while, he comes back down, and while he was up talking to God, they made a golden calf. And they said, hey, everybody, this is God, actually. I know you think God is the Spirit and all, and everything he said, I am who I am, but this golden calf, this is God. And this is the God that brought us up out of Egypt. And Moses gets mad, right? And he should get mad. He gets so mad that he takes those tablets of stone from God, the 10 Commandments, and throws them down on the mountain, and they literally break. He got so mad, he had this golden calf, like this big idol. He had them break it down into fine little pieces of dust, and they put it in their water, and he made them drink it, right? This is like bad discipline. Like, if your parents have ever disciplined you, and it's like, that was the worst discipline I ever got, like, this was it. Like, this was terrible. And God was so mad that he even sent a plague to kill a lot of these people. And you would think that would be enough for God to give up, and he almost did. He told Moses, you know what? I'm giving up on these people, just kind of like he said to Noah, I'm giving up on these people. I'm going to make a nation through you. And Moses bowed down and he prayed and he said, God, no, remember your promise to Abraham. Save these people. And Moses could have just said, yeah, that's great. Nation out of me? Great. My nation? Great. Get rid of them. They're losers too, right? He could have said that because they were losers. But he says, no, remember your promise to Abraham. It goes on. Problem is, this is the reason people stayed in the wilderness, because they complained about everything. In Exodus 14, Exodus 15, 16, 32, 11, Numbers 11, Numbers 12, Numbers 14, Numbers 21. And that's just a couple of them. But the people complained about everything. They complained about Moses. They complained about Aaron. They complained, even like Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother and sister, they complained about Moses. They complained about the food, the water. They got food, and they didn't like the food. It was like when you go to McDonald's and you order something wrong, and then you send it back 1,000 times. Those annoying people, right? That's what the Israelites were. They complained about everything. God provided again and again, but they weren't having it. So God kept them out of the promised land. And in Numbers 13, they show up and they say, okay, we want to enter the land. So Moses sends some spies, 12 spies. 2 of them you probably know, Joshua and Caleb. Those guys go into the land, and they see that it's great, and 10 of them say, no, nah, man. Nah, bro. No. They are too big. We cannot take these guys. It's like when I was in London, and my brother wanted to play basketball with these huge dudes in this park. I'm like, nah, bro. We can't do this. But he's like, yeah, he was Joshua and Caleb. He's like, let's do it. Yeah, we can do it. And we totally lost. So I was right. But, that's what they say. Because they are powerful, and they were big, and they were taller, and they had better land, and it was a land flowing with milk and honey. That's a phrase you probably heard before. That came from right here. But Joshua and Caleb have faith, not in themselves, not in how good they are, not how strong they are, but they have faith in God, that God will do what he promised. And they ended up not going in for a while. So the map kind of started to look like this. They didn't go straight there. They went down to Mount Sinai. They went up. They made a circle. They came back around. And that's a generous map. They probably did more circles and went crazier places. Because 40 years, how do you really spend 40 years in a desert? I don't want to live in Arizona. So California, right? So they do circles and stuff like that. And then they ended up getting there 40 years. And that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. So what? Right? If that's the story, yeah, that all happened. That's history. Why does that even matter? What can I do? I learned all that stuff. Yeah, I've known all that stuff. You didn't teach me anything new, John. I already knew all that stuff. Well, I'm sorry. But so what? What should I do about it? Well, this whole section leads us to one main thing right here, and it's this. You and I, we need to learn who God is. That's what's important. In this section, we need to learn who he is, because in this very specific section called the law, called the Torah, the Pentateuch, a lot of different names for it, but in this section, God reveals who he is. And there's one section of Scripture that is one of the most important in all of the Bible where he talks about himself, and it's Exodus 34, 6 and 7. So let's turn here, and we can end here tonight. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. He says, and let's just hold on before we get there. Remember what we're dealing with. Moses is praying for the people. He prays a couple things. He prays for God's presence to go with them, for God to show the world that he is really God by exalting Israel, by making Israel a great nation. And he also prays for God to show him his glory. So this is in response to that. You can check it out on the screen. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. It said the Lord passed before him. He's revealing himself. This is literally his introduction. This isn't someone else introducing somebody. This is God introducing himself for the first time, really. He says this, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That's who God is. That's what he says right there. Merciful. And as you can see, you can't really see it that well, but the yellow and the green right there, they're kind of broken up into categories. So first of all, mercy. And then second of all, grace, right? I'm merciful and I'm gracious. Mercy and grace. Mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace is getting what you don't deserve. So the idea here is that first one, right, slow to anger. God does not he gets angry, but he doesn't punish them right away. He's merciful. He doesn't give them what they deserve. He's abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands. God and his steadfast love, what that means is that God continues to love people. The people he's promised to love, he continues to love them, even when they don't deserve it. Right? Think about those Israelites in the wilderness. They complained all the time. They did not deserve it, but God showed them his love. It says, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But, end of this verse, but who will by no means clear the guilty. God is a God who is just and will repay sin. It's so important for us to see that. We need to learn who God is. We need to realize, first of all, that God is bigger than you think, and he's also better than you think. God is bigger. He's in control, and we've seen that throughout this whole story on that left side of your worksheet. He's in control. He's bigger, but he's also better than you think. He's merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and he's also, even on the flip side, the side that's bad for the sinners, he's holy, and he's perfect, and he's just. All these awesome things about God. He's bigger, and he's also better. And you and I need to learn that. We need to think about that more often, because our minds can't even wrap around how great God is in its fullness. We can't really do that. So we need to learn more and more. And you could be alive for 1,000 years on earth, and you still wouldn't know everything about God. And that's what's awesome. We can continue to go back to his word and learn more things. So that's the law, right? The story comes from Genesis to Deuteronomy. The so what are we going to do about it? We need to learn who God is. That needs to be what our lives are about. And hopefully that's what you're doing in DBR, especially as we read the Psalms. We learn a lot of good things about God, and I hope you reflect on those things. But another thing I want to do to wrap up all these sermons is talk about the gospel, because the gospel is what God has been doing from the beginning, because man fell and God has had a plan to redeem them. But what do we learn about the gospel from this section? The thing we learn about the gospel is really the background of the gospel. Right? We said learn who God is. We do learn things about God. These 4 things that we're going to write down really quick. First thing, we learn that God is the creator. We know that from that first verse we looked at tonight. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He's the creator. He's in control. He's in charge. He's the one who we have to report to. He's the teacher we got to turn our stuff into. He's the boss we have to report to at work. He's the coach. He's in control. He's God. And the thing is, he's also holy. Leviticus 11:44 and 45 says this, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You should not defile yourselves with any swarming things that crawl on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." And he wants his people to be holy too. So much so that when people aren't holy, he has to punish sin. That's this third thing. He's also just. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4 says, "The rock," that's God, "his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he." And the thing is, that's scary for people who have sinned. That's actually turns into a bad thing, because God turns into our enemy, because if we're sinners and we're up against this holy God who's just, who has to punish sin, then we know there's this problem in our relationship. There needs to be something that fixes that. And the thing that we learned in Exodus 34 at the beginning, verse 6 and 7, is that God is loving. And God chooses to love people. That's the fourth thing. God is loving. I want to just look at this to finish up here. Deuteronomy 7, verse 6 to 8. You don't have to turn there. Just look at it on the screens. Deuteronomy 7, 6. "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God." So God's talking to Israel through Moses right here. He's saying, you are my people. You're my people here. I've chosen you. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possessions. He loves you. He cares about you. He's chosen you out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. So remember, at this time, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of stuff going on, but God chose to love these certain people. Verse 7. "It was not because that you were not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord has set his love on you. It's not because of you that he chose you. For you were the fewest of all the people," right? You aren't worthy of my love. That's not why I chose to love you, because you were good or something. "But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt." See, God's love is a choice, and God's love is shown in action. And what we're going to learn as we continue to study this book is that God showed his love for us, and that while we were sinners, he sent Jesus Christ to die for us. And that's where we get our salvation. By repenting and putting our faith in him, we can have salvation, because God chose to love us. God is in charge. He's holy. He's just, but he's also loving. And because he's loving, we can be saved. So that's just the first 5 books. That's section number 1 of 4 done of the book. And we're going to continue to finish. We're going to finish the Old Testament next week. So I hope you come back next week. So let's pray real quick before we head out and come back for worship night. Let's pray.